So today we're going to talk about the question of whether or not the Civil War was fought over slavery. Right? Now, in the first place, we're going to concede that the North fought the Civil War to preserve the Union. Right? But that begs the question of why was the Union in jeopardy? Right? And really, it's the answer to that question, which is what the Civil War was fought over. Right? And, you have chuckleheads and Lincoln haters out there that'll say, like, oh, it was fought over states' rights. The South seceded over states' rights. But that begs the question of right to what? I mean, rights are not an abstract thing. It's like you have a right to do something. And, you'd have to, at that point, concede, that the South wanted to have a right to own a peculiar form of property. And then there's what's believed to be a more sophisticated argument, which is, it was over tariffs. And that's sort of what I'm going to address in this video. And so, the reason why people really want to believe the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery is because they want to be substantive, right? They want to think that they're rational and they question things that are told to them, and they think that it's edgy to say that the Civil War wasn't really fought over slavery. But really what's edgy is making, what you're putting forward as a definitive video about how the Civil War really was fought over slavery, right, in order to confront these chucklehead Lincoln haters. So reason number one has to do with Stephen Douglas, right? Sum it up. Stephen Douglas, like the South, opposed tariffs, and it was the South that blocked his nomination at the 1860 D convention in Charlotte, right? Democrats and Republicans, I call them D's and I's, right, to kind of make light of the whole situation. So Douglas, he was, really just a towering political figure in the era, right? A great man. I have stories about him. Second, at the time, second in greatness probably to Lincoln, right? I say that he towered over the political scene. Ironically, he was known as the Little Giant because he was a short man, I think 5'4". And he ran for president in 1860, right? And he was opposed by the South because of his views on slavery, right? What he had tried to do in his career was to keep the country together by going to the middle on the slavery issue, right? And what he wanted was for the slavery question to be left to a popular vote, right? That's what he considered to be justice, was when the majority of people decide an issue based on a fair election. Right? In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he famously said that he didn't care whether slavery is voted up or down. Right? And Lincoln's response was basically, well, that is quite strange. But anyway, Douglas was serious, right? The year before the Lincoln-Douglas debates, in 1857, Kansas, when it was organizing to become a state eventually, adopted a pro-slavery constitution known as the Lecompton Constitution, right? And Douglas opposed this because it was well known that the process by which it was adopted was fraudulent, right? So Douglas was really committed to popular sovereignty. It was like the basis of his career in many ways. These things caused considerable opposition to Douglas in the South. They even, in the Senate, he was a senator from Illinois, Northern Democrat. In the Senate, the South even got him removed from his longtime position as chairman of the Committee on Territories. Right? That's why his opinion about slavery in the territories was so important. Right? And in 1860, the South was fanatically pro-slavery. Right? They were hysterically paranoid about Northern opposition to slavery, and especially given John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which had just happened in October of 1859. Right? They thought the North was out to come get them for their slaves. And at the 1860 D convention in Charleston, the South demanded a candidate for president that supported a federal slave code in the territories. Right? This would have prevented territories from banning Southerners from bringing their peculiar property with them to the territories, right? And Douglas couldn't give them this, right? And, it wouldn't have done him any good to give them this because he needed a few northern states to win, right? He needed Pennsylvania and something like either Indiana and Illinois. And a compromise here would have doomed him, right? So I'm assuming that if he had just gotten the Democrat nomination, he was assuming that he would have swept the South, right? He would have had the South, and then he needed also Pennsylvania and Indiana or Illinois, right? And he couldn't have those states if he compromised on the slave code, right? So he was in an untenable political position, right? But it was not because of his position on tariffs, right? Douglas, it does not seem to me that Douglas was unacceptable to the South on tariffs, right? And it seems to me that if the South really wanted to win that election, and if tariffs were really what motivated the South, then its best chance to win would have been to compromise and back Douglas, right? Certainly it is conceivable that Douglas could have won, or at least that was their best chance, right? But instead what happened was, there ended up pretty much being 3 Democrat candidates. Lincoln won. And so if tariffs were central to the Southern mindset at the time, it is just baffling why the real Southern states were so hostile to Douglas. Right now, I'm not saying that the R's campaigned on slavery. Right? They did and they didn't. What I read is that in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they actually campaigned on tariffs. Right? So I'm not saying that tariffs weren't an issue, but if they were central, then the South would have supported Douglas, right? And elsewhere, the R's campaigned on internal improvements, is the phrase that they used, right? Like infrastructure. But what the R's campaigned on is not really the issue with regard to the Civil War. The issue is the D's, right, and secession, and what caused that. So anyway, Lincoln won the election. Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as president of the Confederacy first, and that brings us to the second event. Reason number 2, right, the lame duck period. So what a lame duck period is it's a period after an election where the successor has already been elected, but just hasn't taken office yet, right? So you have the president, and the next president's already been elected, and the period before the new president takes office is the lame duck period, right? And in this case, James Buchanan was the lame duck president, and he really didn't do anything to help the situation, and he's somewhat of a disgrace. And they had a longer lame duck period than we do. For us, it's like 2.5 months, right? From whatever it is, the first Tuesday in November to something like January 20th or something like that. In this case, it was 5 months, right? The election was on November 6th, 1860, and Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. So they had a really long lame duck period. And, big surprise, there were efforts in Congress to negotiate a compromise to prevent the South from seceding. In Kentucky, following the legacy of Henry Clay, saw itself as sort of the compromise state, right? Henry Clay is really one of the significant political figures from the first half of the 19th century. He was a congressman, a representative from Kentucky, and he wasn't literally the first Speaker of the House, but he was the first one to really make the Speaker of the House what we think of it as today. Not to say it hasn't changed since then, but he really brought character to that role of Speaker of the House. Right? He ran for president many times, always failed, but 3 times he negotiated historic compromises between the North and the South that we might say preserved the Union at that time. Right? In 1820, 1833, and 1850, right? Henry Clay negotiated these compromises, and so Kentucky, especially politicos in Kentucky, had it in their mind that Kentucky was the compromise state. Right? And so a senator from Kentucky, John J. Crittenden, took the lead of trying to broker a compromise. Right? And there was a committee that considered this compromise, and it had, some very big names. It had Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, William Seward, senator from New York, and Jefferson Davis, who became president of the Confederacy, right? They were all on this committee. But here's the point, okay? This is it right here. This is reason number 2. The only subject dealt with by the Crittenden Compromise was slavery, okay? So you would think that when they, come to Congress to negotiate a compromise to preserve the Union, that they would deal with the relevant issues, right? And yet the only issue that they dealt with was slavery, okay? And, there were R's that showed interest in these efforts, right? Including Seward, who, he was the guy that Lincoln beat for the R nomination, and Seward ended up becoming his Secretary of State. But the president-elect, right, Lincoln, he decided to squash the whole compromise deal, right? He wrote to the Republicans, he wrote to Seward, I have some comments from Lincoln to Seward right here. He says, quote, "The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter." Right? He also wrote that Crittenden's compromise would, quote, "lose us everything gained by the election, and that making slave states would follow to put us again on the high road to a slave empire." Lincoln said that the compromise acknowledges that slavery has equal rights with liberty and surrenders all we have contended for. We have just carried an election on principles fairly stated to the people. Now we are told in advance the government shall be broken up unless we surrender to those we have beaten. If we surrender, it is the end of us. A year will not pass till we shall have to take Cuba as a condition upon which they will stay in the Union. So, real quick, here's a bonus point for you. Those are the 2 reasons. This is a bonus point, right? You'll notice, if you look, that Lincoln haters, chuckleheads, they complain about some statements in Lincoln's first inaugural address. They're like, oh, got him. Civil War is not about slavery. You see that? We got him. I'll read an example in a minute. But they miss the context, right? It's a superficial reading of the inaugural address that dwells on these statements. And the context was that in this period of time, it was completely up in the air whether or not 3 border states would secede, right? Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. Right? And Lincoln needed them to stay in the Union, right? They all voted for Democrats in the recent presidential election the year before, right? Kentucky and Maryland went to pro-slavery Southerners. Missouri went to Stephen Douglas, right? So it was not clear that these states would stay in the Union. And they were more industrialized than the other Southern states because they were further north, less dependent on slavery. And so they would have nearly doubled the Confederacy's power if they had seceded. And also, the Ohio River borders Kentucky, right? And that's a big deal, right? If the Confederacy had been able to go all the way up there and then attack from there. And, people talk about like, oh, the slave states stayed in the Union. Now, even though there was a question whether or not these slave states would secede, slave states are not all the same, right? Like, these slave states that I'm talking about, and also Delaware, but there was never any question about Delaware staying in the Union. But the border slave states, the proportion of slaves and slave owners to the population was less than half in these states what it was in the 11 states that seceded. And so the first inaugural, it was not really about the war aims. It was about keeping these states in the Union. Or if we were to read it well and say that it was about the war aims, then what it reveals is that really the aim of the war was to win, right? Because it was a political speech. So here's the line that the main line that people pick on from the speech. This is Lincoln's gotcha line, right? It says, "The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anyway." Okay. So anyway, if you compare Lincoln's remarks in his first inaugural to the ones that I read, that he wrote to Seward about the Crittenden Compromise, it is quite clear that in private, slavery was very central to Lincoln's view about the whole issue, right? right? An inaugural address is a public speech, okay? So it has to be viewed that way, right? And actually, I think about it, even up to this time, from the beginning of the Civil War, the Union was capturing Confederate slaves, right? And it had tacit endorsement from the highest Union authorities, including Abraham Lincoln. They just couldn't be explicit about it. And so what they did was they gave the captured slaves a special status known as contraband, right? They were in a questionable legal situation, right? But it was wartime. It wasn't understood to be permanent. And you have to consider, for instance, John C. Fremont, right? He was the first Republican to run for president. It was in 1856, and he lost. And he was kind of an eccentric guy, and he was a general in the beginning of the Civil War in Missouri, one of the states that might have seceded, and he knew about this policy of contraband, and he decided, I'm going to follow it to its logical conclusion, and he decided to free the slaves in Missouri, right? He issued a policy that somehow or other all slaves are free or will be free. And people were like, oh no, we're trying to keep Missouri in the Union, like this is going to piss everyone off, and it contradicts Lincoln's inaugural address, and so forth and so on. And so Lincoln had to fire Fremont, right? For the same reason that he, had to have his inaugural address the way that he did, right? Because of politics, right? Because he needed the border states, right? At one point, Lincoln said, I'd like to have God on my side, but I need to have Kentucky, right? So Stephen Douglas was opposed by the South because of slavery. He was acceptable on tariffs, right? And the Crittenden Compromise only dealt with slavery. You can look it up, Crittenden Compromise. And bonus point, the first inaugural was drafted specifically with the border slave states in mind. Hashtag Lincoln did nothing wrong. Hashtag Plato for the win. Hashtag Strauss it up. Hashtag West Saida.